turning and turning in the widening jar. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood dimmed, the tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are filled with passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand, the second coming. Hardly are those words out when some vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with the lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. Darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. I had a most enlightening talk recently with a man about the Nazis and how they came to power. He said that the so-called German Revolution was really based on simple blackmail. This is his story. Old President Hindenburg had always been a poor man. He decided near the end to change that situation, and he had his son Oskar von Hindenburg take over his business affairs. Oskar then speculated on the stock exchange, and when the crash came, suddenly owed 1.3 million marks. To make this back, Oskar then let himself get involved in the Eastern Relief manipulation, the Osthilfe. I don't think his father knew, but the Nazis found out in 1932. The Hitlerites got photostats of the incriminating documents, and from then on had the whip hand. So it seems that we owe the unutterable misery into which we have come to blackmail and a financial lapse by Paul von Hindenburg. I happened to be in Munich recently, just as one of the official festivals, which are by now an everyday occurrence, was being celebrated as to the blare of tubas and the rat-tat of drums. I couldn't get a room at my usual hotel near the station, so I found a place to sleep in the old city opposite a school in which a visiting Hitler youth troupe had been lodged for the holiday period. I saw one of these boys had just thrown off his knapsack. Look about him at the empty classroom. I observed how his glance fell on the crucifix hanging behind the teacher's desk, how in an instant this young, still soft face contorted in fury, how he ripped this symbol to which the cathedrals of Germany and the ringing progressions of the St. Matthew Passion are consecrated off the wall and threw it out the window with a cry, "Lie there, you dirty Jew." I've seen this. Among people I know, I've heard of more than one case of children denouncing their parents politically and thereby delivering them to the axe. My life in this pit is now entering its 5th year. For more than 42 months, I have thought hate. I have lain down with hate in my heart, have dreamt hate and awakened with hate. I suffocate in the knowledge that I am the prisoner of a horde of vicious apes, and I rack my brains over the perpetual riddle of how this same people can have sunk into this stupor and is incapable any longer of perceiving its shame for the shame that it is. I saw Hitler last in Saarbrück, slowly gliding by in a car with armor-plated sides, while An armed bodyguard of motorcyclists rode in front as further protection, a jelly-like slag grey face, a moon face into which two melancholy jet-black eyes had been set like raisins. Today, I hear that Hitler recently ended a report by Wilhelm Keitel, the army commander, which had given him reason for dissatisfaction by throwing a bronze vase at the head of the general. Isn't this the kind of thing that happens when a whole people is sinking into the cesspool of its own disgrace? A whole people. I'm no mystic, I'm a child of my time, despite all foreboding, and I hold strictly to what I see, and what I saw gliding by there, like the Prince of Darkness himself, was no human being. I've met him a few times. First time at the home of my friend Clemens von Frankenstein, who was at the time the director of the Munich State Opera. According to the butler, one of those present was forcing his way in everywhere. It was Hitler. He had managed an invitation to Klay's house under the guise of being interested in operatic scene design. He very likely had the idea that theatrical design was connected to interior decorating and wallpaper hanging, his former profession. He'd come to the house where he'd never been before, dressed in gaiters, a floppy wide-brimmed hat, carrying a riding whip. And there was a collie, too. The effect among the Gobelin tapestries and cool marble walls was something akin to a cowboy sitting down on the steps of a Baroque altar in leather breeches and spurs with a Colt revolver at his side. Eventually managed to launch himself into speech. He talked on and on endlessly. He preached. He went on at us like a division chaplain in the army. We didn't demur or venture to differ in any way, but he began to bellow at us. The servants thought we were being attacked and rushed in to defend us. When he had gone, we sat quietly, confused. There was a feeling of dismay, as when on a train you suddenly find that you're sharing a compartment with a psychotic. We sat a long time and no one talked, until finally Clay stood up and opened one of the huge windows to let in the spring air. The fresh air did help to dispel the feeling of oppression. It was not that an unclean body had been in the room, but something else. The unclean essence of a monstrosity. I used to ride at the Munich Armory, after which I liked to eat at the Lowenbau Keller. That was the second meeting. At first glance, the tightly clenched insecurity seemed to be gone, which allowed him to launch at once into one of his tirades. I'd ridden hard and was tremendously hungry. I wanted just to be left alone to eat in peace. Instead, I had poured out over me every one of the political platitudes in his book. That Machiavellianism by which German foreign policy became a series of legalized burglaries. The activity of its leaders a succession of embezzlements, forgeries, and treaty breaches. With his oily hair falling into his face while he ranted, he had the look of a man trying to seduce the cook. In almost 20 years, absolutely nothing has happened since I first saw him to make me change my first view of him. The fact remains that he basically hates himself, and that his opportunism, his immeasurable need for recognition, and his now apocalyptic vanity are all based on one thing: a consuming drive to drown out the pain in his psyche. The trauma of monstrosity. There he sat, a raw vegetable Genghis Khan, a womanless Napoleon, a teetotaling Alexander. an effigy of Bismarck, who would very likely have had to go to bed for 4 weeks if he tried to eat just one of Bismarck's breakfasts. I'd driven into town, and since at that time, September 1932, the streets were already quite unsafe. I had a loaded revolver with me in that almost deserted restaurant. I could have shot him. If I'd had any inkling of the role this piece of filth was to play, of the years of suffering it was to make us endure, I would have done it without a second thought. But I took him for a character in a comic strip, and I didn't shoot. Would have made no difference anyway. Our martyrdom had already been decided. If Hitler at that point had been tied to the railway tracks, the train would have been derailed before it got to him. But when his hour strikes, the end will come down upon his head from every possible direction. There are many rumors of attempts to assassinate him. Well, yes. The attempts fail, and they will continue to fail. For years it has seemed that God is asleep. I'm writing this in a Berlin hotel, which is about as quiet and discreet as a howitzer. Pondering the great changes of the 19th century, I realize that at the moment 70 years ago, when Germany, in its infatuation with prosperity, agreed to let Prussia be its advisor and its procurer, it went to the dogs. Prussia is a state patched together out of bits and pieces. It was never meant to be a nation. To hold together the monstrous structure, the Prussians had to put all their energies into their military machine, as a result of which no middle class and no true cult of the learned could ever come into being. This, then, is where the preference for the provisional and the second rate was born. This disposition towards ersatz can be seen in the Baroque trappings of the kings of Prussia, the gilded plaster of their palaces, accompanied by the demand, backed up by the gun, to please, if you will, be so good as to accept all this as solid and definitive and valid. This, then, is where the eternal more originated, the deification of the threadbare, the cult of the ugly. This is the place where the eye-bulging hatred against everybody who had more, the ceaseless eyeing of other people's prosperity, the readiness to sudden banditry, and the drive to make this Prussian cult of the threadbare into the state religion of Germany was born. And they will, if other people prove recalcitrant, use their guns. Yes. And here I touch on the central political problem facing Europe today. When the Prussian oligarchy, which was at least aware that it had responsibility, disappeared, the men of Versailles were guilty of the incredible stupidity of dismembering Austria. After that, all that was needed was for Prussian greed to combine with the political condottieri, and the catastrophe which all of us knew was in the making was upon us. It may be a German problem today, but tomorrow it will be a matter for Europe and the world to resolve. The time is fast approaching when Europe will have to decide. If it will let itself be engulfed, or will finally defend its own heart from the Prussian drive for power. My friends have taken the occasion to give me warning about my writings. Driven as I am by my own inner necessity, I must ignore these warnings and continue with these notes. Night after night, I hide this record deep in the woods on my land, constantly on the lookout lest I'm observed, constantly changing my hiding place. And that's how we live. My vanished friends. Do you who left Germany 4 or more years ago have any idea how completely without legal status we are? of what it is to be threatened with denunciation at any time. Will you actually be able to understand that flight was more comfortable than remaining at the dangerous outpost and illegal watcher among the barbarians? Will you be able to grasp what it has meant to spend these long years with a heart filled with hate? Hate at lying down, hate at rising, hate through the long hours of bad dreams, and all this without any rights under the law, without the smallest compromise, without a single Heil Hitler, without a single attendance at a meeting, whilst through it all the stigma of illegality sits on one's brow. Do you think we'll speak the same language when this is over? Will you grasp the death-like loneliness of our lives and the misery-laden air of the catacombs we have been reading for so long have made these eyes incredibly clear-sighted? May it not be that within moments of your return, the visions that these eyes can see in the distance will frighten you. We live in a gigantic spiritual vacuum. What are the words? The end of the world is at hand that Dostoevsky wrote 70 years ago, but an intimation of the apocalyptic horseman now thundering down upon us, and a prophecy of how utterly lost we have become. Yes, truly, Dostoevsky is right. The end of the world is at hand. The Anschluss. Now Austria. We've seen it coming for weeks. Naturally, we knew what it all meant. The threats and the staged riots, the whole shabby performance designed to provide a reason for intervention, and our tank and artillery columns are rolling down every street as though the enemy were a European great power and not a tiny nation of 7 million inhabitants. I see in this generalized brutality, this nasty satisfaction at the fate of the Austrian leaders, this general delight in ridicule and rape, something ignoble which makes me deeply ashamed. Austria. Poor eternally derided Austria, whose only sin was that until the end, and in the face of the attack by Greater Prussia, it had held to one last recollection of the noble old Holy Roman Empire. In Salzburg, where I've been staying these past few days, these Berlin potato faces fill the streets, together with their full-bosomed females. Thanks to the rate of exchange, they can make off with everything for a song, including goods which are no longer available in Germany, and the shelves are now empty. Why in the world did the Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg not give the order to shoot? In one last attempt to awaken the world from its incomprehensible lethargy, I foresee the day when the nations will regret their cowardly passivity. Cost will be beyond measuring, but they will have to pay it someday. In this first great breach of the peace, the criminal has been let go unpunished, and we, who are his only opponents inside Germany, his only opponents, are made weaker and more impotent. And what did everyone do? They stood around and they watched, thus making impossible any resistance inside Germany. What are they doing today? They're standing around and watching, preoccupied with figuring out a way to avoid irritating Herr Hitler. As I write, a whole flight of bombers is droning past overhead. For the past hour, that drone has gone on above as though those planes were flying against a world power. I will hate and curse you from my grave. And it will be your children and your children's children who will have to bear this curse. I have no weapon against you but this curse. I know that it withers the heart of him who utters it. I do not know if I'll survive your downfall, but this I do know, that any man must hate this Germany with all his heart if he truly loves it. I'm a German. And I encircle this land in which I live with all my love. Never again can I be torn from here without going to seed. I tremble for each tree and wood that disappears, for each silent valley that is devastated, for each stream that these pirates of industry, the real masters of our land, threaten. No, I'm not crying, but I do. And when I do, it is out of fury and shame, not out of sadness. Does one, do I, recognize this regime as a legitimate government? I have, since January the 30th, 1933, never ceased to view it as criminal. Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht. I rack my brains to discover the meaning of this persecution of the Jews that Goebbels has now instigated. At a time when the regime most urgently needed peace, surely this must call forth the deadly enmity of the whole world and make war inevitable. Surely this must call forth the deadly enmity of the whole world and make war inevitable. Max Moore's dead. A light goes out and another until finally the theatre's dark and the stage, where all was light and animation only a short time before, is empty. Every now and then an icy wind sweeps out of the dark room behind onto the stage. Courage is required to go on living now. Courage and a daily summoning up of one's will. For the last few years, to go on living has been to go on hating. Well, let no one fool himself about the nature of such hatred. It is the father of action. The way out of our defiled and desecrated house is through the command to hate Satan. Only thus will we earn the right to search in the darkness for the way of love. 1939, the signing of the Russo-German Non-Aggression Pact. Spring 1940, the fall of France, Holland, Belgium, Denmark, Norway. Every nation normally puts its demons, its delusions, its impossible dreams away into the vaults and cellars and underground prisons of its unconscious. Germany has reversed the process and let them loose. The contents have escaped like the winds out of Pandora's box, and a storm is raging across this long-suffering old earth. Germany, drunk with victory, is sick. People sell stolen paintings and sculptures. In wine cellars, they deal in securities and silk stockings and ownerless French factories with stolen machines and with soup spoons, toilet soap, and rubber goods. In Berlin, absolutely everybody deals, and that is Germany today. Industry pulls the strings. The instrument of power is terror, and industry holds tight to it. They control all the means by which to manipulate public opinion, to influence public opinion, and have thereby stupefied the mass to the point of idiocy. And it should be observed here that my own viewpoint is that of a conservative, and further observed that between this viewpoint and that of the nationalists is a chasm as wide as a canyon. To be a conservative means to be a believer in the immutable laws of this old earth that will shake and quake when the day finally comes for it to cleanse itself of all this filth. But I'm supposed to deify this right. I'm supposed to sing in praise of deception, murder, treaty breaking. I'm supposed to join in the shrieks and the jubilant shouts as the enemy falls like a burning torch from his exploding airplane. In a Berlin cinema recently, I watched the newsreel in which Hitler, standing in front of the historic railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, receives the news of the capitulation of France and begins to dance on one leg like I tell you, I've never been so ashamed of my countrymen as I was there in that cinema, surrounded by the clamour of a mob in ecstasy at the sight of its hopping furor. I got up and I left. I was supposed to do that hopping filth the honour of applauding it. If I'd given any clearer expression of what I was really thinking, I'd very likely have been lynched. What price a forest if the national interest calls for a factory? A German cathedral that stands in the way of an autobahn. Of course, I.G. Farben welcomed Hitler. He gave their poison factory the aura of philosophy, nationalism. A state of mind in which you do not love your own country so much as you hate somebody else's, a nationalism. Under its aegis, morality decays, ancient customs die out, men are uprooted, the steadfast derided, the thoughtful branded, the rivers poisoned, and the forests destroyed. On my way home today from Villach, I stopped at the quarry, still shimmering in the autumn sun. A sand viper, just about to take its midday siesta, was crawling into the protective shadow of the rocks, and I looked at it for a long time. And it looked back at me through its knowledgeable and weird and mutely mournful eyes. There's a legend at home that these reptiles are created out of the old and ever-renewed earth to suck up all the acids and poisons that ooze out of the deeds resulting from human cruelty. And out of all of our sins,